Imagine living 20 years with someone, building a life together, sharing dreams, and creating memories that seem unbreakable. Now, imagine discovering something that will turn your reality upside down. Something so surprising that challenges everything you thought you knew about your life and your partner. After 2 decades of marriage, she never imagined that the man she shared her life with could be hiding such a deep secret. A secret he had known from the very beginning. But why hide it? Why wait so long to reveal it? Today, we're diving into a story of love, lies, and the truth that took 20 years to come to light. Get ready to understand what truly happens when love and identity meet at an unexpected crossroads. As you listen to this story unfold, we want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. We love hearing from you. The life they built. For 2 decades, they had built a life together. In the quiet suburbs, in a modest home adorned with the memories of years gone by, Emily and Robert had created what appeared to be the perfect marriage. To their friends and family, they were the embodiment of stability and love. They had met in their late 20s, both young professionals, eager to begin a life together. They quickly found common ground in their shared values, their love for music, and their dreams of one day having a family. Emily often smiled as she looked around their home. Photos on the walls, a cozy living room filled with books, a kitchen that always smelled of fresh coffee. Their house was more than just a roof over their heads. It was a testament to their hard work, dedication, and the love that had grown between them over the years. They had 2 children now, both teenagers. Their son Josh, a talented soccer player with a bright future, and their daughter Sarah, who had recently started high school. Emily often found herself marveling at how fast time had passed. It felt like just yesterday that she was holding Josh in her arms for the first time, and now he was preparing to drive. They had created a life, a family, a future that seemed solid and unshakable. Robert too had his moments of reflection. He loved Emily deeply. She was his rock, his partner, the woman who had stood by his side through thick and thin. They had navigated the ups and downs of life together, the job changes, the financial struggles, the sleepless nights when the kids were younger. They had a shared history that no one could take away from them. Robert had always been the calm, steady presence in their marriage. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was with a quiet certainty that made others listen. Emily admired this about him, often feeling comforted by his grounded nature. They had never been the type of couple to engage in public displays of affection. Their love was not loud or overly dramatic, but it was enduring. Emily would often think back to their early days together, the nights spent talking for hours, the long walks in the park, and the way Robert's eyes would light up when they discussed their hopes and dreams. It had been the foundation of everything they had built. Their relationship, while not without its challenges, had seemed effortless in its rhythm. There were no major conflicts, no moments of deep betrayal, no signs that something was wrong. They had their occasional disagreements like any couple, but they always found a way to resolve them, to move forward. They had the kind of marriage that people looked up to. Friends would often say how lucky they were, how well they complemented each other. Emily never questioned their relationship. She never suspected that there was anything hidden beneath the surface. Robert had always been the dependable, loving husband, the father who coached Josh's soccer team and helped Sarah with her school projects. He had been everything she had ever wanted in a partner, but there were moments, fleeting and almost imperceptible, when Emily would catch a glimpse of something she couldn't quite place. A strange hesitation in Robert's eyes when they talked about their future. A subtle distance that sometimes lingered between them. She had chalked it up to the stress of work, the responsibilities of raising 2 children, and the daily grind that inevitably dulls the shine of even the happiest marriages. Life had a way of doing that, didn't it? But now, looking back, Emily realized there had always been small signs, subtle clues that something wasn't quite as it seemed. She had dismissed them at the time, believing that life was just moving too fast and that everything would settle down eventually. After all, who could have imagined that after 20 years, her life would be turned upside down by a truth she never saw coming? As she looked out the window that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily felt a strange sense of unease. It was as if she was on the edge of something unknown, something that would soon alter the course of her life forever. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the feeling lingered. This was the life they had built, a life that now seemed fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. And little did she know the cracks had already begun to form, hidden beneath the surface of what appeared to be the perfect marriage. The hidden truth. In the weeks that followed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything she could directly pinpoint, just a growing unease that gnawed at her from within. Robert, her husband of 20 years, was still the man she loved, steady, reliable, and affectionate when the moment called for it. But there were moments now, little moments, that felt different. It was almost as if there was a shadow between them, something unspoken that lingered in the air. The first sign came one evening when they were sitting in the living room, as they often did after dinner, watching TV together. Robert had been distant, his eyes focused on the screen, but his mind clearly somewhere else. Emily reached over to rest her hand on his, a small, familiar gesture that they had shared countless times before. But tonight, instead of the warm, familiar squeeze of his hand in response, Robert stiffened slightly. His hand remained still, almost unresponsive. "Are you okay?" Emily had asked softly, her voice tinged with concern. Robert had looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, before he gave a small, forced smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." It was a simple response, but something in his tone didn't sit right with her. It was the way his words seemed to carry a weight, as if he were hiding something. She didn't press him further that evening, but the feeling of discomfort stayed with her, growing stronger over the next few days. At work, Emily found herself distracted, unable to focus on her tasks. Her mind kept drifting back to Robert, to the small moments that didn't quite add up. It wasn't just the lack of warmth in their usual gestures, or the occasional coldness in his voice. There was also something in his eyes, something that flickered quickly, like a brief moment of hesitation or uncertainty, before it was quickly hidden behind a mask of normalcy. She began to notice it in other ways as well. Robert had become less engaged in their conversations. When they talked about their future, about plans for their kids, or even their upcoming vacation, he seemed to be distracted, almost distant. It wasn't as though he was ignoring her. It was as if he was simply no longer fully present in the moment, as if his mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts he wasn't sharing with her. One afternoon, Emily returned home early from work, her mind preoccupied with a conversation she'd had with her best friend, Jessica. They'd been discussing relationships as women often did, and Jessica had asked the question that stuck with Emily. "Do you ever feel like something's off with Robert?" It was a question that made Emily pause, but she had shrugged it off. She loved Robert. They had been through so much together, and their relationship had always felt solid. She was just being paranoid, she thought. But when she arrived home that afternoon, she was hit with a strange sense of déjà vu. Robert was in the kitchen, but instead of the usual warmth in his greeting, he looked at her with a fleeting sense of discomfort. "Hey, hun, how was your day?" he asked, his voice sounding almost robotic. "It was fine. I got home early today," she replied, trying to sound casual, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Robert nodded, but there was a tension in the way he stood, his posture stiff and unnatural. Emily's heart began to race. She wasn't sure why, but it felt like he was hiding something. Without thinking, she asked, "Are you okay, Robert? You seem different." He froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the floor. "I'm fine, really. Just tired." "Is that all? You don't seem like yourself lately," Emily pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert sighed deeply, a long breath that seemed to carry with it years of frustration and restraint. "Maybe I'm just going through something. I don't know, Em. It's complicated. The word sent a chill through Emily's spine. There it was again. The distance in his voice, the evasiveness in his words. This wasn't the Robert she knew. This wasn't the man who would always open up to her, who shared everything. He was holding something back, something significant. Emily's mind began to race. Was it work stress? Was he having an affair? Or was it something else, something deeper, something more personal? She didn't know, but she could feel the truth lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Emily noticed Robert's hands trembling slightly as he reached for his glass of water. The subtle tremor didn't escape her attention, and she found herself staring at him, her mind spinning. What was going on? Why was he acting so strange? Why was he so distant, so withdrawn? It was then that she realized she didn't know him as well as she thought she did. There was something he was keeping from her. And no matter how much she tried to convince herself that everything was fine, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The truth, whatever it was just out of reach. But Emily knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it came to light. The moment of discovery. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Emily had returned home from work, as she always did, expecting the usual evening routine. Dinner with Robert, the kids, perhaps a bit of time on the couch watching their favorite TV shows. But that evening, something was different. The atmosphere in the house was charged with an energy that Emily couldn't ignore. She had become so attuned to the shifts in Robert's mood, the subtle changes in his behavior, that she could feel the weight of the air in the room. It was as if something was about to break, and it was only a matter of time before it happened. Robert was sitting at the kitchen table, his head bowed, hands folded in front of him. It wasn't like him to be so still, so withdrawn. Emily set down her bag, her heart beating faster than usual, as she sensed that tonight would be the night everything would change. "Robert," she called gently, her voice a little shaky. "What's going on? Why do you look so distant?" Robert didn't immediately respond. He took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to say something he had been holding back for too long. Emily's stomach tightened in anticipation. She knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. She just didn't know how difficult it would be. "I need to tell you something," Robert said finally, his voice low and hesitant. Emily's pulse quickened. She couldn't remember the last time he had sounded so uncertain. She nodded, urging him to continue, though her mind was already racing, trying to prepare for whatever he was about to say. She had no idea what was coming, but she had an overwhelming sense that her world was about to be shattered. "I've been keeping something from you," Robert began, his voice thick with emotion. "Something that I should have told you a long time ago." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She had suspected for some time that something was wrong, but hearing him admit it out loud made everything so much more real. Robert paused, struggling to find the right words. He looked up at Emily, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "I'm not the man you think I am, Em. I never was." The statement hit Emily like a punch to the gut. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process what Robert had just said. She stared at him, unable to form a coherent thought. The man she had shared her life with, the man who had been her rock, the father of her children. He was telling her that everything she thought she knew about him was a lie. "Robert, what are you talking about?" she finally managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. I'm gay," he said, his voice cracking as the words left his mouth. "I've known it for a long time, but I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to face it or face you." The room seemed to close in around Emily. The words felt like they were echoing in her head, reverberating with a sound that drowned out everything else. It wasn't possible. She had to be hearing things. This couldn't be real. The man she had loved for 20 years, her husband, the father of her children, was telling her that he was gay. She took a step back, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. No, this isn't happening," she muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're telling me this now, after all these years?" Robert nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I know. I should have told you sooner, but I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of losing everything. The tears that Emily had been holding back finally broke free. She felt the raw ache of betrayal, the shock of discovering something that had been hidden from her for so long. She felt a wave of anger rise within her, followed by an overwhelming sense of heartbreak. "You lied to me. You've been lying to me for 20 years, Emily said, her voice trembling with emotion. "How could you do this? How could you keep something like this from me?" Robert's face contorted with guilt. "I didn't want to lie to you, but I didn't know how to live my truth, not with you, not with anyone. I thought if I ignored it, if I buried it deep enough, it would just go away. But it never did." Emily turned away from him, her mind spinning. The weight of his words crushed her. She felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under her, leaving her floating in an endless abyss. How could she have been so blind? How had she missed the signs? Was their entire marriage a lie? "I don't even know who you are anymore," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," Robert replied softly. "And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily could hear her own breath, shallow and ragged, as the magnitude of the revelation began to settle in. She had spent the last 20 years building a life with this man, only to discover that the foundation of everything they had was built on a secret, one that had been buried so deeply that she had never suspected its existence. The truth was out now, but Emily didn't know if she could ever look at Robert the same way again. The struggle within. In the days that followed Robert's confession, Emily felt as if she were living in a fog. The world around her had blurred into a haze, and every step she took seemed heavy, burdened by the weight of the truth that had shattered her life. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt cold and unfamiliar. Every corner seemed to echo with the silence of unspoken words, and every object in the room felt like a reminder of the life she had thought she knew. She had spent years building a family with Robert, a life full of shared dreams and moments that now felt hollow. How could everything she had believed in, everything she had worked for, suddenly crumble like this? The pain was almost unbearable, and she found herself questioning everything: her marriage, her role as a wife, even her own ability to trust. Emily had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one who held everything together. But now she felt weak, vulnerable, lost. How could she have missed the signs? How could she have loved someone so deeply for so long without ever suspecting that he was hiding such a fundamental truth about himself? Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. There was the anger, raw and fiery, that surged every time she thought about the years of deception. How could Robert have kept this from her? How could he have lived a lie for 2 decades, pretending to be someone he wasn't, all while she stood beside him, believing in the future they were building together? And then there was the pain, the deep, aching sadness that filled her every time she looked at him. The man she had once called her best friend, her partner, was now a stranger to her. It wasn't just the revelation of his sexuality, it was the betrayal, the realization that their entire life together had been built on a secret. For years, Emily had trusted Robert, and now that trust felt like it had been shattered beyond repair. But there was also confusion. Emily wasn't sure what to do with the flood of emotions that overwhelmed her. Part of her wanted to run, to escape from the man who had betrayed her. But another part of her, a much smaller part, still loved him. Robert had been a constant in her life for so long. They had built a family together, raised children, supported each other through both the highs and lows. Could she just throw all of that away? She spent sleepless nights tossing and turning in bed, the questions swirling in her mind like a never-ending storm. Should she try to forgive him? Could she even begin to understand his pain, his fear of coming out all these years? Was she strong enough to face the truth and rebuild her life, with or without him? It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted her. It was the idea that she had been living in the dark, unaware of the man she had been married to all these years. The person she had trusted implicitly had been hiding a huge part of himself, And now she had to face the uncomfortable reality that their entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. How could she ever truly know him again? Emily found herself retreating inward, pulling away from Robert as she processed her emotions. Every time he tried to talk to her, to explain himself, she couldn't bear to listen. His words felt hollow, as if he were trying to justify something that couldn't be justified. She needed time. She needed space to figure out what this revelation meant for her, for their family, for everything they had built together. At the same time, part of her felt guilty. Was she being too harsh? Robert had admitted his truth, and that took a certain amount of courage. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that his confession was more about relieving his own guilt than about giving her the respect she deserved as his partner. After all, he had waited until everything had built up to this breaking point, until his secret had become something she could no longer ignore. But in the silence that hung between them, Emily couldn't help but wonder, was there any way back from this? Could they rebuild their marriage, even after everything had been laid bare? Or was this the end of the road, the beginning of a new chapter that would be written without him by her side? In the depths of her soul, Emily knew that the struggle within her was only just beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, and the choices she would have to make in the coming weeks and months would determine the rest of her life. But for now, she couldn't bear to face them. All she could do was sit with her pain, letting it wash over her as she tried to make sense of the man she had loved and the woman she was becoming. The husband's secret. Robert sat alone in the dimly lit living room, his hands trembling as he stared at the floor. It had been days since he had told Emily the truth, and the weight of his confession still felt suffocating. Every word he had said to her, every moment of vulnerability, had come rushing back to him with a force he wasn't prepared for. He had thought that admitting his secret would be a release, that finally telling her the truth would set him free. But now, it only felt like a heavy burden, one that he couldn't escape. He had always known he was different. From the time he was young, Robert had felt an attraction to other men, an awareness of his true identity that felt both foreign and terrifying. But he had never had the language to explain it. In his small town, growing up in a family that placed great importance on tradition, the idea of being anything other than straight was not just frowned upon, it was unthinkable. His parents had raised him with the belief that marriage was sacred, that a man and a woman were meant to be together, to build a family, to live out a shared life. And so, Robert had buried his truth deep inside himself, convinced that it was something that could be ignored. When he met Emily, he had been drawn to her kindness, her warmth, her unwavering belief in the future they would build together. She had all the qualities he had ever imagined in a wife, strong, supportive, loving, and he had fallen in love with her. But deep down, he knew that something essential was missing. He wasn't the man she thought he was. He wasn't the man anyone thought he was. For years, Robert had tried to suppress his feelings. He had convinced himself that if he loved Emily enough, if he played the part of the perfect husband, his secret would eventually fade into the background. But the truth had a way of resurfacing time and time again. Every time he held her, every time they shared a quiet evening together, Robert felt the weight of the lie pressing down on him. How could he continue to live a life that wasn't true? How could he continue to pretend to be someone he wasn't? And yet he stayed. He stayed because he couldn't bear the thought of losing Emily. He couldn't imagine life without her, without their children, without the life they had built together. He had spent years convincing himself that he could keep the truth hidden, that it wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But as time went on, the guilt began to eat at him. It was a constant companion, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. He remembered the countless times he had considered telling her, opening up about who he really was. But fear had always held him back. Fear of rejection, fear of losing the life he had so carefully constructed, fear of losing everything that mattered to him. Robert had convinced himself that the cost of telling Emily the truth was too high, but in the end, the cost of keeping it a secret had been even greater. When he finally confessed to her, when the words left his lips, he felt a mixture of relief and terror. It was like a dam had broken, and all the emotions he had been suppressing for years flooded to the surface. But the moment the truth was out, he knew there was no going back. He had betrayed her trust, betrayed their marriage, and now the consequences were unfolding before him. He had known that telling her would change everything, but he hadn't realized how deeply it would hurt. As Robert sat in the dark, he realized that the pain he was feeling was not just about losing Emily. It was about losing the life he had tried so hard to build, the life he had convinced himself was possible, even when he knew deep down it wasn't. The weight of his secret had driven a wedge between him and the woman he loved, and now he was left to face the consequences of his choices. He had hoped that, in time, Emily would understand. He had hoped that she would see his confession as an act of bravery, a way of finally being true to himself. But now, as he sat alone in the silence, he wasn't so sure. He had spent so long hiding, so long living in fear of his own identity, that he didn't know how to begin to make things right. The secret that had haunted him for years was no longer a secret. It was the truth, and it was destroying everything he had ever known. Facing the past. The days following Robert's confession were a blur, a constant cycle of quiet reflection and painful realizations. Emily spent her nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, lost in her thoughts. The house, once filled with the laughter of their children and the comfort of familiar routines, now felt like a foreign place. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of the truth that hung in the air, suffocating everything. How could she have missed it? How could she have spent so many years with Robert, believing in their love, believing in the future they had built, without ever seeing the cracks beneath the surface? Emily found herself replaying the past over and over again in her mind. She thought about their early years together, the days when everything felt effortless, when they were a young couple full of dreams and plans. The memories were bittersweet now, laced with the painful awareness that they had been living a lie. She remembered the first time she met Robert. It was at a mutual friend's party, and Emily had been struck by his quiet confidence, his easy smile, and the way he seemed so comfortable in his own skin. He had been everything she wanted in a partner: kind, dependable, steady. She had fallen for him quickly, as if she had always known that he was the one she was meant to be with. Their courtship had been simple but sincere. They spent hours talking, laughing, sharing their hopes for the future. Emily had believed wholeheartedly that Robert was the man she was going to grow old with. They talked about their wedding day, about buying a house, about raising a family. She had always imagined they would grow old together, and in many ways she had believed they were invincible, that nothing could tear them apart. But now, looking back, Emily saw the moments she had missed, the signs she had ignored, the small things, like Robert's hesitation when they talked about the future, the times he seemed withdrawn, as if something was bothering him, but he never talked about it. The way he sometimes pulled away when she reached for him, as if he were physically present but emotionally distant. At the time, she had dismissed it as stress from work or the pressures of raising children. But now, she saw them for what they truly were, signals that Robert had been struggling with something deep inside himself. Her mind wandered back to their early years of marriage, those first few months when everything had felt so right. She remembered how they had spent hours talking about their dreams, about traveling, about building a life that was uniquely theirs. Robert had always been the rock in their relationship, the one who kept things grounded. He had been steady, dependable, qualities she admired in him. But as the years passed, Emily began to notice that there were parts of Robert that never seemed to fully engage with their life together. It wasn't that he was absent, but there was a distance, a wall that seemed to grow taller as time went on. She thought about the times they had fought, those rare moments when their differences seemed to explode into arguments. But even in those moments, there was always a sense that Robert was holding back, that there was something more to his silence than he was letting on. She had often wondered why he was so reluctant to open up about his feelings, why he sometimes seemed to retreat into himself. But each time, she had assumed it was just part of his personality, his way of coping with stress or difficult situations. Emily's mind then turned to their children. They had raised two wonderful kids, Josh and Sarah, both of whom had grown into young adults with their own hopes and dreams. Their family had always felt like a team, united, strong, loving. Emily had been so focused on keeping things together, on being the best mother and wife she could be, that she had never stopped to question whether there was more to their family dynamic than what met the eye. She had trusted Robert completely, believing in the foundation they had built. But now, everything felt so uncertain. How could she have missed the truth? How had she been so blind to the signs? She had always prided herself on being intuitive, on knowing when something was wrong. But now, she wondered how much she had really known about Robert. How much of their life together had been built on a facade. Emily knew that facing the past was the only way forward, but it wasn't easy. She had to confront the reality of the man she had spent so many years with, and the truth was harder to bear than she could have ever imagined. Each memory, each conversation, each moment she had shared with Robert now felt like it carried a hidden weight, a secret that had been kept from her for far too long. As she sat quietly in their living room, staring at the empty space between them, Emily felt the sting of betrayal. But she also realized that this moment, this painful confrontation with the past, was the beginning of something new. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew that she couldn't continue to live in the shadow of the lies anymore. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The emotional tornado. The days following the confession were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily. It felt as though the ground beneath her had been ripped away, and she was suspended in a storm of confusion, anger, and sorrow. Each morning, she woke up with the same overwhelming feeling of dread, a sense that the life she had known was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her mind spun constantly, replaying the conversation with Robert over and over again. She had heard the words, but it felt like her brain was still processing their true meaning. Was she even capable of understanding the gravity of what he had said? Her anger was fierce, like a fire that burned through her chest every time she thought about the lies Robert had told her. He had spent 20 years hiding his true self, hiding something that was fundamental to who he was. And in doing so, he had not only betrayed her trust, but had betrayed the very foundation of their life together. It wasn't just the secrecy about his sexuality, it was the deceit, the withholding of the most important part of himself. It hurt to think about how much of their marriage had been built on a lie. It hurt to think about all the moments of connection, all the memories, all the shared dreams that now seemed tainted. But alongside the anger, there was something else, something much harder to confront, the deep sadness that seemed to settle into her bones. Emily had spent years building a life with Robert, a life that had felt safe, secure, and full of promise. And now, that life was unraveling. She couldn't ignore the overwhelming sense of loss she felt. It wasn't just the idea of their marriage that was slipping away. It was the person she had thought Robert was. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, was now a stranger to her. Every time she looked at him, she felt as though she was seeing him for the first time. How could she have been so blind? How could she have spent so many years with someone, believing in their bond, only to find out that there was a part of him so essential, so crucial to their connection, that she never even knew existed? The pain of that realization was almost unbearable. Yet despite everything, Emily knew that there was still a part of her that loved Robert. The love they had shared was not easily erased. The years of their marriage, the laughter, the shared experiences, they weren't just gone. There was history there, history that couldn't simply be written off. The man sitting across from her now, with his eyes filled with remorse and regret, was the same man she had once called her best friend, the same man who had stood by her side through so many challenges. How could she just throw all of that away? Robert, too, was caught in an emotional storm of his own. He had expected some degree of pain when he finally came out to Emily, but he hadn't prepared himself for the crushing weight of guilt that pressed down on him. The look in her eyes, the hurt, the betrayal, it tore at him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. He had always believed that telling Emily the truth would somehow ease the burden he had carried for so long. But now, with the consequences unfolding, he realized that there was no easy path forward. His truth had set him free, but it had also torn apart everything he had ever known. Every time he tried to explain himself, to tell her how sorry he was, his words seemed inadequate. They seemed small and insignificant compared to the damage that had been done. He had spent so many years running from his own truth, hiding behind the facade of a life that wasn't truly his, that now he felt like a stranger in his own skin. The man he had been pretending to be was gone, but he wasn't sure who he was anymore. Emily's pain was a constant reminder of how much he had hurt her. Every time she withdrew from him, every time she looked at him with that expression of confusion and betrayal, it felt like a knife to his chest. He wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that he still loved her and that he was sorry for everything, but he knew that it wasn't enough. He had betrayed her in ways that couldn't easily be forgiven, and he wasn't sure how to begin to make amends. The emotional tornado they were both caught in seemed to have no end. They were two people standing at the edge of their lives, unsure of which direction to go. Emily wanted to move on, to find a way to heal, but the pain of the truth was suffocating. Robert wanted to rebuild, to prove to her that he could be the man she needed him to be, but he knew that the road ahead would be long and that nothing would ever be the same. In the quiet moments, when they were alone with their thoughts, both Emily and Robert found themselves wondering, could their love survive this, or was this the end of everything they had known? Coming to terms. The days continued to stretch on, each one feeling heavier than the last. But as time passed, Emily and Robert found themselves at a crossroads, two people standing on the edge of a new reality, unsure of how to take the next step. There was no easy fix, no magic words that would heal the wounds, no simple solutions. But Emily knew that she couldn't stay in the place of confusion and hurt forever. The weight of the truth was crushing, but it also gave her a choice: to accept it and begin moving forward, or to let the bitterness swallow her whole. For Robert, it was a moment of reckoning. He had spent years hiding from his own truth, and now, in the light of his confession, he realized that there was no turning back. There was no undoing the damage he had caused, no erasing the years of silence and deception. He had lived in the shadows of his own identity for far too long, and now, as Emily grappled with the fallout, Robert had to face his own demons, the ones he had buried so deeply inside for so long. Emily wasn't sure what the next step looked like. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive Robert, or if forgiveness was even something she could offer him at this point. The love she had felt for him was still there, buried beneath the hurt, but the betrayal loomed over it like a shadow, blocking out the light. Yet, in the stillness of the night, she began to realize that forgiveness didn't mean pretending that everything was okay. It didn't mean sweeping the truth under the rug and pretending that their marriage hadn't been built on a lie. It meant accepting that this was the new reality, painful, raw, but real. It wasn't just about forgiving Robert either. It was about forgiving herself. She had trusted him implicitly, believed in their life together, and now that belief felt like a betrayal of her own instincts. How could she have been so blind? How could she have ignored the signs? Emily realized that in some ways she'd been complicit in her own ignorance. She had accepted the version of Robert that he presented to her, never once questioning the cracks in their foundation. But she also understood that she couldn't change the past. What she could control was how she moved forward. Emily started to look at her life in a different way. She wasn't the same person she had been before the truth came out. She had been forced to confront her own vulnerabilities, her own feelings of inadequacy and fear. She had been living in a fairy tale, one that had been shattered, but now she had to rebuild, not just her relationship with Robert, but her sense of self. For Robert, coming to terms with the reality of his actions was just as difficult. He had hoped that by revealing the truth, he would somehow be free, that Emily would understand and, in time, accept him for who he truly was. But as he saw the pain in her eyes, he realized that the truth came with consequences that he hadn't fully anticipated. He had hoped that telling Emily would be an act of redemption, but now he saw that the damage he had done went far deeper than he had ever imagined. The woman he had once known, the woman he had spent 20 years building a life with, was now distant, a stranger in many ways. And yet, he still loved her. It was a love that felt different now, rawer, more complicated, but it was still there. He couldn't expect her to forgive him easily, but he hoped that over time they could find a way to coexist in this new reality. He knew he had to rebuild trust, but that would take time, and time was something they didn't have in abundance. Robert had to learn to live with the consequences of his actions, understanding that no matter how much he wished he could turn back time, there was no undoing what had been done. They sat across from each other in the quiet of their living room, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air between them. There was no resolution yet, no neat conclusion to their story, but there was a tentative sense of understanding, a recognition that both of them had to grow, separately and together. Emily looked at Robert, the man who had once been her everything, and for the first time since the truth came out, she saw him not just as the man who had betrayed her, but as a human being, struggling with his own pain. It wasn't an easy thing to accept, and it didn't make the hurt any less real, but it was a step toward healing. For the first time in a long while, Emily and Robert didn't talk about the future. They didn't make promises or assumptions. Instead, they simply acknowledged the present, the pain, the confusion, and the possibility that somehow, in time, they might find a way to move forward, whether together or apart. The decision to move forward. The days were quieter now, filled with an awkward stillness that hung between Emily and Robert. It wasn't a silence of comfort. Rather, it was one of uncertainty. Each day felt like a delicate balancing act, as both of them tiptoed around the truth, unsure of how to proceed. The emotional weight of their past hung heavy in the air, but it was clear that time had begun to work in their favor, allowing them a bit of space to think, to reflect, and to slowly start making decisions about what came next. Emily's mind was a battlefield. She had spent the last few weeks torn between what her heart wanted and what her mind was telling her was the right thing to do. She loved Robert. She always had. But could she truly rebuild their life together after the betrayal she had experienced? Could she ever look at him the same way again? And, more importantly, could she forgive him, not just for his actions, but for the pain he had caused her? The idea of moving forward together was something that seemed impossible at times. The weight of the secret he had kept for so long, the years of dishonesty, how could she just move past that? But at the same time, she couldn't ignore the history they had together, the love they had shared, the family they had built. Emily knew that those years had not been without value. They had meant something. So was it possible to salvage anything from the wreckage of their marriage? As the days passed, she started to realize that the decision she had to make wasn't just about Robert. It was about her own future, her own happiness. She had been so focused on making their marriage work, on doing what was expected, that she had neglected her own needs, her own desires, for far too long. Now, she had to consider her own path, independent of Robert, and figure out who she was without him as her anchor. Robert, too, was lost in his thoughts. He had spent so many years hiding from the truth, from himself and from Emily, that now, in the wake of his confession, he was left to question everything about his life. He loved Emily. He truly did. But the life they had built, was it still something worth saving? He couldn't deny the connection they shared, the bond that had been forged over 2 decades. But was that enough? Could he ask Emily to rebuild something that had been shattered so completely? In many ways, Robert knew that the trust they had once shared would be impossible to regain. No matter how many times he apologized, no matter how hard he tried to show her he was sorry, the betrayal had left an indelible mark. He had made a choice that had affected not just his life, but Emily's, their children's, and everyone around them. Could he live with the consequences of that choice? Would Emily ever be able to see him as the man he truly was, and not just as the person who had deceived her for so long? And yet, despite all the pain, despite all the uncertainty, Robert couldn't shake the hope that perhaps, in time, they could find a way to rebuild, not necessarily as a couple, but as co-parents, as individuals who had shared something beautiful and painful and profound. He had come to accept that he couldn't change the past, but he could still make decisions about his future. And Emily, he realized, had that same power. They had talked about separation, of course. It was the most logical option after everything that had happened. But neither of them was ready to take that step yet. The thought of ending their marriage, of walking away from everything they had built, was too much to bear. There was still too much love between them, too much history to make such a final decision so soon. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Emily and Robert sat down in the living room, facing each other across the same space where their lives had changed forever. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken words, but there was a quiet understanding between them. This wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what they would choose to do now. "I don't know what the future holds," Emily said softly, breaking the silence, "but I can't keep living in this limbo. I need to figure out who I am again, outside of everything that's happened. I need to rebuild myself." Robert nodded, his heart heavy with guilt. "I understand. I don't expect you to just forgive me and move on. I don't deserve that. But I want you to know that I'll be here, no matter what you decide. I want you to be happy, Em. I always have." For the first time in a long while, Emily felt a small sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't an answer to all her questions, but it was a start. She didn't have to have everything figured out right now. She just needed to take one step at a time. The decision to move forward wasn't clear-cut, and it wasn't easy. But in that moment, they both realized that the most important thing was to take control of their own lives. Emily didn't know if she would stay married to Robert, but she knew that the journey ahead would be about healing, whether together or apart. A new beginning. The days after the decision to move forward were filled with uncertainty, but also with the quiet promise of possibility. Emily and Robert were not the same people they had been before. The truth had irrevocably changed them, but perhaps, in some strange way, it had also set them free. The pain was still raw, and the scars would remain for a long time, but there was something empowering in the knowledge that they were both choosing to move forward. Their lives weren't defined by what had happened, but by what they decided to do now. For Emily, the journey to healing was slow. She took each day one step at a time, focusing on herself, rediscovering who she was outside of the marriage. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had given away over the years, how much she had buried in the name of maintaining the perfect family, the perfect life. Now, with Robert's truth laid bare, she had to learn to live for herself. She took up hobbies she had neglected, spent more time with friends she hadn't seen in years, and slowly she began to feel more like the person she had been before the weight of the marriage and the secrets had taken over her life. Emily also spent time reflecting on what her future might look like, without the pressure of being the wife of a man with secrets. She didn't know if she would ever feel comfortable in her marriage again, but she also knew she didn't have to make that decision right away. She allowed herself the grace of time, not rushing into anything, not forcing herself to make any promises. Her relationship with Robert was in a delicate place. They weren't exactly separated, but neither were they the same couple they had once been. They had come to understand that their relationship would be different, but that didn't mean it was over. They still cared for each other, still shared the same history, and they both wanted to see each other happy. Robert's honesty had brought them to this point, and now they had to redefine what their future together might be. they still communicated, of course, especially when it came to their children. There was a shared understanding that their family needed to remain intact, that their kids needed to feel secure, despite the changes. But there were also moments of vulnerability, where they spoke of what they had lost and what they were trying to rebuild. They didn't know if they would ever be able to fully trust each other again, but they were both learning to embrace the idea that rebuilding could take many different forms. For Robert, the journey was just as difficult, if not more so. He had spent years hiding his true self, and the weight of his actions weighed on him every single day. It wasn't just about the pain he had caused Emily, it was about his own sense of identity. For so long, he had been living a lie, and now he had to confront the man he truly was. Coming out had been the first step, but it was just the beginning of a much larger process of self-acceptance. Robert spent a lot of time thinking about his life and what he truly wanted. He wasn't sure where he fit in the world anymore, or where his place was in the future of his family. He knew that he had broken Emily's heart, and no amount of time or apology could change that. But he also knew that he had to be true to himself, even if it meant facing the consequences of his choices. He sought therapy, hoping to better understand his own feelings and motivations, and he worked hard to build a sense of self-worth outside of his marriage. The most difficult part of this new beginning for Robert was realizing that, for the first time, he was not just part of a couple, but an individual who had to stand on his own. There was no going back to the way things had been, and though that truth was painful, it was also liberating. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was moving in the right direction, even if it was uncertain. Emily and Robert were no longer the people they had been when they first met. The life they had built together had been torn apart, but in its place, they were each finding new versions of themselves. They didn't know what the future held, but they had learned to embrace the unknown. The love they once shared was still there, but it had evolved, just as they had. Whether they would stay together or go their separate ways, they had both come to understand that this was not the end. It was, in fact, a new beginning, and as they both took those first steps into the next chapter of their lives, they found a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a promise of perfection, but it was the promise of growth, of healing, and the understanding that life could still hold beautiful things, even in the face of loss.